For over a decade, just switch to Linux was the punchline of PC gaming, not the advice. Gamers were told year after year that Linux couldn't run their library, couldn't run their favorite competitive shooter, and definitely couldn't run whatever new 8.0a release just dropped on Steam. That reputation was earned. But 2026 is shaping up to be the year that reputation finally stops matching reality, and the numbers backing that up are hard to wave away. For the first time since Valve started publishing its monthly Steam hardware and software survey, Linux has broken past 5% of the platform's entire user base, hitting 5.33% in March 2026, the single largest one-month jump the survey has ever recorded. That might sound small next to Windows, which still commands the overwhelming majority of Steam's install base, but 5.33% of Steam's roughly 140 million monthly active users works out to somewhere around 7 to 7.5 million people gaming on Linux every single month. That's not a hobbyist curiosity anymore. That's a market segment large enough that publishers, driver teams, and anti-cheat vendors can no longer pretend it doesn't exist. So what actually changed? Three things collided at once, and together they explain why 2026 feels different from every previous "is this the year of Linux gaming" cycle that came before it. The first is Proton, Valve's compatibility layer that translates Windows game code into something Linux can run. Proton isn't new, but the pace of its improvement has picked up dramatically. Valve's latest major release, Proton 11, arrived as a beta in April 2026, built on top of Wine 11, and it brought a genuinely significant technical upgrade: support for something called NT-Sync, which moves part of Windows' internal synchronization, handling directly into the Linux kernel. In plain terms, this means smoother frame pacing and less CPU overhead when Windows games run through Proton, since the translation layer no longer has to work as hard to fake Windows-style thread synchronization in user space. Recent updates have also restored playability to older, previously broken titles, expanded controller support for Sony's DualSense controllers, and even shipped an early ARM64 build, which hints that Valve is preparing Proton to run on non-x86 hardware down the line, almost certainly a nod toward future handheld and console-style devices. The scale of what Proton actually unlocks is easy to undersell. According to compatibility tracking sites and community databases, Proton has expanded the realistically playable Linux game catalog from roughly 9,000 native Linux titles to something in the neighborhood of 100,000 or more playable Windows games once you count everything that runs through the compatibility layer. Community reporting suggests somewhere around 90% of Windows titles on Steam now launch successfully on Linux in some form, whether that's an officially verified badge or just a game quietly working once you force Proton on it yourself. And that second part matters more than most people realize. Steam's own compatibility labels are deliberately conservative. A game marked as not compatible doesn't necessarily mean it won't run. It often just means Valve hasn't formally tested and signed off on it, or the developer hasn't opted in. Plenty of Linux users have learned that flipping on Enable Steam Play for all other titles in Steam settings and manually forcing something like Proton Experimental gets far more of their library running than the official labels would suggest. The second major force behind this shift is the Steam Deck and its slow burn effect on the entire PC gaming ecosystem. Every Steam Deck that ships is, by definition, a Linux gaming device running Valve's own Steam OS. With several million units sold since launch, the deck has done something no amount of desktop Linux advocacy ever managed. It's normalized the idea that a mainstream, non-technical gamer can pick up a device, turn it on, and play their existing Steam library without ever thinking about the fact that it's not running Windows underneath. Valve's Deck Verified rating system reinforced this by turning compatibility from a guessing game into a simple badge system: verified, playable, or unsupported. So players don't need to comb through forums to figure out whether a game will behave itself. That effect appears to be spilling over into desktop Linux gaming as well, with gaming-oriented distributions built specifically to feel like an extension of the Steam Deck experience gaining ground fast. Distributions such as Bazite and CachyOS both aim squarely at gamers who want a SteamOS-like. Convenience on a regular desktop or laptop have been among the fastest growing corners of the Linux gaming world through late 2025 and into 2026. Even as SteamOS itself remains the single largest slice of the Linux Steam population thanks to the Deck's install base. The third factor is less about engineering and more about timing. Windows 10 reached its official end of support date in October 2025, and Windows 11 comes bundled with hardware requirements, most notably mandatory TPM 2.0 support, that lock out a meaningful chunk of older, otherwise perfectly capable gaming PCs. That combination has pushed a wave of Windows 10 holdouts to make a real decision instead of quietly delaying it. Buy new hardware just to satisfy Windows 11's requirements. Keep running an operating system that no longer receives security updates, or try something else entirely. For a lot of people with older but serviceable rigs, Linux has become the something else, and reports from Linux-focused outlets suggest hundreds of thousands of users have already made that jump specifically around the Windows 10 cutoff. None of this means Linux gaming has become a frictionless drop-in replacement for Windows, and it's worth being honest about where the cracks still show. The single biggest remaining obstacle isn't a technical one at all, it's anti-cheat, and specifically whether publishers choose to enable it for Linux and Proton. Both of the two dominant anti-cheat systems used across the industry, Easy Anti-Cheat and BattlEye, have technically supported Linux and Proton for a few years now. The catch is that support has to be manually enabled and configured by each individual game's developer. It isn't automatic just because the underlying anti-cheat vendor supports it in principle. That single developer decision point has created a genuinely uneven landscape. Some competitive multiplayer titles run great on Linux. Others, often the biggest live service games with the largest player counts, remain effectively Windows only because their publisher has simply never flipped the switch, whether out of caution about cheating, resource constraints, or general lack of urgency now that mobile and console dominate their attention. High-profile cases like Grand Theft Auto Online's shaky Linux compatibility after certain anti-cheat updates, or Bungie's upcoming shooter marathon apparently steering clear of Linux support entirely, show that this isn't a solved problem. It's an ongoing negotiation between Valve and individual studios, title by title. There's also a driver and hardware stability story that doesn't get talked about enough. Because so much of the Linux gaming stack, the graphics drivers, the compatibility shims, the kernel itself, moves fast and is developed in the open, regressions do happen. A kernel update or a graphics stack change can occasionally break something that worked perfectly the week before in a way that's less common on Windows, where Microsoft and hardware vendors coordinate driver rollouts more conservatively. For enthusiasts who don't mind troubleshooting occasionally, this is a minor annoyance. For someone who just wants to turn their computer on and play, it's a real barrier, and it's part of why community forums and Discord servers have become almost mandatory reading for new Linux gamers trying to solve a weird crash or a missing controller feature. And then there's simple inertia, which shouldn't be underestimated. Most PC users don't switch operating systems unless something forces the issue. A broken game, an unsupported piece of hardware, a support deadline, or frustration with where Windows is heading design-wise. Linux is currently benefiting from several of those pressures landing at once. But that doesn't automatically mean people who switch will stay switched once the immediate pain point is resolved. Some analysts following the Steam hardware survey closely have pointed out that the true test isn't whether Linux can hit a symbolic number like 5%, but whether it can hold on to that share in the months afterward. Once the wave of Windows 10 refugees settles down and only the harder to convert Windows loyalists remain. So, can Linux actually replace Windows for gamers in 2026? The honest answer is, for a specific and rapidly growing group of people, yes, functionally, it already has. If your library leans towards single-player games, older titles, indie games, or competitive titles whose developers have bothered to enable Linux anti-cheat support, there's a very good chance your entire experience on Linux today is close to indistinguishable from Windows, sometimes with better battery life and frame consistency on handheld or thermally limited hardware, according to communities. Benchmarking. If you're chasing the latest anti-cheat locked live service shooter the day it launches, or you rely on niche peripherals and software with Linux-unfriendly drivers, you're likely still better off keeping a foot in the Windows world for now. What's genuinely new about 2026 isn't that Linux gaming suddenly became perfect. It's that the conversation has shifted from can Linux run my games at all to which specific games still don't work and why. That's a much smaller, much more solvable problem than the one Linux gamers were dealing with even 3 or 4 years ago. And it's the reason Valve, hardware partners, and a growing number of publishers are treating Linux as a platform worth real investment rather than a curiosity to be tolerated. It's worth stepping back for a moment and remembering just how bad things used to be, because the contrast is a big part of why 2026 feels like such a turning point. Linux gaming has technically existed for decades, but for most of that history it meant one of two things: hunting down a small handful of native Linux ports that developers bothered to compile, or wrestling with Wine, the open source compatibility layer that Proton itself is actually built on top of. Wine on its own was notoriously finicky. Getting a modern Windows game running meant digging through forum threads, downloading obscure configuration files, tweaking registry-like settings inside a fake Windows environment, and hoping a shader compilation bug didn't crash the game halfway through a loading screen. It worked, technically, often enough to keep a small, extremely dedicated community around it, but it was never something you could hand to an average gamer and expect a good experience. Valve's decision to fund and formalize Proton starting back in 2018 changed the trajectory entirely, because it took that same underlying wine technology and put a full-time engineering team behind, smoothing out the rough edges, plus a business incentive to keep doing so. Every game that runs well on Linux is a game Valve can sell through Steam, regardless of what operating system someone owns. That incentive is really the quiet engine behind everything else in this story. Microsoft has no equivalent motivation to make Windows games run better on Linux. Valve has every motivation, because Steam's business model doesn't care what OS is underneath it, and the Steam Deck gave that motivation a concrete mass-market product to build toward. That brings us back to where things actually stand today, and it's worth going a level deeper than the headline market share number, because the composition of that Linux slice tells its own story. Steam survey data shows that within the Linux user base itself, SteamOS, specifically the version that ships on Steam Deck hardware, remains the single largest chunk, though its share of the Linux pie has actually been slipping slightly as more people adopt gaming-focused desktop distributions instead. Arch Linux and Linux Mint both hold meaningful shares among desktop Linux gamers, but the fastest-growing names are ones built explicitly to mimic the Steam Deck's plug-and-play feel on a regular desktop or laptop. Distributions like Bazzite and CachyOS package, SteamOS-style conveniences, gaming-optimized kernels, and pre-configured Proton setups so that installing them feels a lot closer to installing SteamOS than to a traditional Linux distribution that expects you to configure everything by hand. This matters because one of the oldest complaints about desktop Linux, that it demands a baseline of technical fluency most gamers simply don't have, is being actively engineered away, not through better documentation, but through distributions that make the hard mode configuration choices for you before you even boot up for the first time. Valve has also been working on the other end of that same problem, making SteamOS itself, the exact operating system that runs on Steam Deck, available as a general-purpose install on other hardware, rather than something locked to Valve's own device. Reporting throughout 2026 has pointed to a broader desktop rollout of SteamOS being in the pipeline, which would let anyone install the same console-like, curated experience that makes the Deck approachable onto their own gaming PC or handheld from a third-party manufacturer. If that lands the way Valve appears to be aiming for, it would meaningfully lower the barrier to entry that currently keeps a lot of curious Windows gamers from ever trying a full-time switch, since the appeal of SteamOS was never really, it's Linux, it was, it just works. And extending that promise beyond Valve's own hardware is a logical next step. There's also been a steady drumbeat of hardware speculation swirling around all of this. Rumors and partial leaks throughout 2026 have pointed toward Valve developing successor hardware to the original Steam Deck, potentially featuring more powerful graphics silicon, and there's been persistent chatter about a living room-focused Steam Machine-style device as well, an idea Valve has flirted with once before and seemingly never fully abandoned. Alongside that, competing manufacturers have leaned into the same SteamOS-adjacent ecosystem with their own handhelds, and there's been renewed talk of dedicated VR hardware from Valve that would need its own compatibility layer for existing headset software. Part of why Proton's newer ARM64 builds and expanded architecture support have looked less like a random engineering side quest and more like groundwork being laid for hardware that hasn't been announced yet. None of this is confirmed in the way a shipped product would be, but the pattern is consistent. Valve is investing in Linux not as a philosophical statement, but as the technical foundation for an entire hardware strategy that no longer assumes Windows underneath. On the software side, the sheer scale of what's now playable deserves a bit more unpacking than a single statistic can convey. Community-driven compatibility databases exist specifically to track, game by game, how well individual titles run through Proton, cataloging things like whether a title needs a specific Proton version, whether it requires a particular launch command to work around a driver quirk, whether video cutscenes play correctly, and whether online multiplayer functions at all. These databases have become genuinely essential reading for anyone considering the switch, because they turn will my games work from a leap of faith into something you can actually check title by title before you ever repartition a hard drive. The picture that emerges from browsing them is uneven but encouraging. The overwhelming majority of single-player games, regardless of age, tend to work either flawlessly or with only minor cosmetic issues. Older titles in particular are often not just playable but genuinely well supported, since compatibility fixes tend to accumulate over time as more people report issues, and Valve's engineers patch them into subsequent Proton releases. Newer releases are more of a mixed bag depending on how aggressively they use newer graphics APIs, DRM systems, or anti-tamper technology, but even there, the trend line over the past couple of years has clearly moved toward more titles working at launch rather than needing months of community effort to become playable, Anti-cheat remains the exception that proves the rule, and it's worth explaining why it's such a uniquely stubborn problem rather than just another item on a compatibility checklist. Kernel-level anti-cheat software works by embedding itself deep inside the operating system to watch for the kinds of low-level tampering that cheat developers rely on. That approach is fundamentally difficult to reconcile with Proton, because Proton doesn't run Windows games inside an actual Windows kernel. It translates their calls into Linux equivalents. A Windows anti-cheat driver. Expecting genuine Windows kernel behavior can't simply be dropped into that environment and expect it to function, unless the anti-cheat vendor specifically builds and maintains a Linux-compatible mode. Both of the industry's dominant anti-cheat providers have done exactly that, technically for a few years now, and Valve has been vocal about wanting more developers to flip on that support. But enabling it isn't automatic. Each individual studio has to actively integrate the Linux-compatible build into their game, test it, and in some cases have a direct conversation with the anti-cheat vendor to get access to the correct components. That's an extra line item on someone's project checklist, and plenty of studios simply don't prioritize it, either because they're worried a smaller, differently behaved user base makes cheat detection statistically harder to reason about, because Linux's relatively small player share doesn't seem worth the engineering hours, or simply because nobody on the team has gotten around to asking. The result is a genuinely bifurcated landscape, and it's one of the few areas where blanket statements about Linux gaming in 2026 fall apart the moment you get specific. Plenty of anti-cheat protected competitive games run perfectly well on Linux today because their developers did the integration work. Others, including some of the biggest live service names in the industry, remain effectively Windows exclusive, not because of any technical wall Valve hasn't solved, but because of a business decision nobody has revisited. High-profile shooters launching later in 2026 have, in some cases, drawn criticism from the Linux community specifically for showing no signs of enabling anti-cheat support at launch, reviving the same frustration that's dogged competitive Linux gaming for years. The platform can run almost anything technically, but almost anything quietly excludes some of the specific games a lot of people spend the most hours playing. Beyond anti-cheat, there are smaller but real friction points worth being upfront about. Peripheral support is generally solid for mainstream gear. Most popular controllers, including newer Sony DualSense pads with their haptic feedback and adaptive triggers, now work well through Proton in a growing number of titles. But more obscure accessories, specialty flight sticks, racing wheels, or niche RGB lighting software frequently lack the polished Linux drivers their Windows counterparts enjoy. Graphics driver stability, particularly on the open source side of the ecosystem, has improved enormously, but can still occasionally regress after a kernel or graphics stack update in a way that's rarer on Windows, where driver rollouts tend to be more centrally coordinated. And there's a real, if shrinking, learning curve for anything beyond the Steam Deck's curated experience. Desktop Linux gaming, even on gaming-focused distributions, occasionally still asks you to open a terminal, read an error message, or tweak a launch option, which is a bar plenty of casual gamers simply have no interest in clearing, however low that bar has gotten compared to a few years ago. All of that said, the momentum genuinely is different this time, and it's worth being specific about why, because Linux gaming is having a moment, has been said before, without much staying power behind it. Previous surges tended to be driven by a single event, a controversial Windows update, a viral video, a burst of enthusiast press that faded once the news cycle moved on. What's happening in 2026 is being driven by structural ongoing pressure from several directions simultaneously, and none of those pressures are going away on their own. Windows 10's end-of-support deadline isn't a headline that fades. It's a permanent shift in which operating systems receive security patches, and every month that passes makes staying on an unsupported OS look worse, not better. Windows 11's hardware requirements aren't a temporary inconvenience. They're a permanent line in the sand that older but perfectly capable gaming PCs sit on the wrong side of. And Valve's Proton investment isn't a marketing campaign. It's tied directly to hardware Valve has already sold millions of units of, with more apparently on the way, meaning the underlying incentive to keep improving compatibility isn't going anywhere either. There's also a broader cultural shift worth noting. A meaningful segment of PC gamers have grown increasingly uneasy with the direction Windows itself has taken as a product. Between advertising integrated into the operating system, deeper AI feature integration some users didn't ask for, and a general sense that Windows increasingly wants to be a platform for Microsoft's own services first, and a neutral place to run software second. None of that is a technical argument for Linux, but it's a real emotional and practical one, and it's part of why some of the people making the switch this year describe it less as chasing a specific feature and more as being pushed away from something they were already unhappy with. That kind of motivation tends to be stickier than a pure feature comparison because it's less easily reversed by a single Windows update addressing one complaint. So, pulling all of this together, can Linux actually replace Windows for gamers in 2026? The honest, unhedged answer is that it depends entirely on what's actually in your library and what you expect from your setup, and that answer is more nuanced than either the enthusiast case or the skeptic's case alone. If your gaming life is built primarily around single-player titles, older or classic, games, indie darlings, or competitive multiplayer games whose developers have specifically done the work to enable Linux-compatible anti-cheat, there's a very strong G argument that Linux already delivers an experience indistinguishable from Windows day-to-day, and on certain thermally constrained or battery-powered hardware, community benchmarking suggests it can actually edge out Windows on frame time consistency and battery life. If your library leans heavily on the newest live service shooters the moment they launch, or you depend on niche peripherals and creative software with spotty Linux driver support, you're likely still better served keeping Windows around, at least for now, whether as your primary system or as a dual boot fallback for the handful of titles that genuinely need it. What seems safe to say is that the old framing, Linux gaming as a permanent, hopeless, also ran next to Windows, no longer matches the evidence. The newer framing, where Linux is a legitimate, rapidly maturing second option with a shrinking but real list of specific gaps, is a far more accurate description of where things stand as this year plays out. Whether that eventually tips into something that genuinely displaces Windows as the default choice for PC gaming, or simply settles into a permanent, healthy second-place position that keeps Microsoft honest, is still an open question. But for the first time in a very long time, it's a question people are actually debating with real numbers behind it, instead of dismissing outright the way they would have just a few years ago.